Hello, my name is Stefan Mabry, and I'm a PhD student at the University of North Dakota. Today, I'll be examining the trade-off between accuracy and explainability in critical care, and then explore how a hybrid NeuroFuzzy model can help bridge that gap, as it's compared to both neuro and fuzzy models independently. So, some of the background for this project. Critical care runs on data, but prediction without explanation can't drive safe action. So that line is our starting point for this entire study. Modern ICUs and emergency departments, they capture vitals and labs and notes and orders, and nearly every heartbeat plus real time. But there's a real bottleneck in converting that stream of data into decisions that help people, by keeping them alive and avoiding harm, long-term harm. So we're focused here on, can we explain predictions created by some of these models so that a clinician can use them at the bedside with knowledge that, these are the right decisions that are being made. That evidence is important because clinicians have liability and they have a moral responsibility to patients to do what's best for them. And so if they can't explain why they have to do something or why they should be doing something, then they probably shouldn't be doing it. So the ICUs and the emergency departments are unforgiving environments. Patients can go from stable to crashing in minutes, and so the teams are juggling multiple unstable patients while working in noisy or while working with noisy and incomplete information. So in that setting, a risk model that's more accurate matters, but also a model that's reliable and understandable matters more, because then we can take those recommendations made by the AI and turn them into actionable, actionable directives. So previously we used scores like the Apache or SOFA or News to determine how patients are doing in the ICU. It takes labs and vitals and demographics into a sensitivity number, but these numbers don't adjust themselves when when cases shift, and they also are kind of static in time. They can be updated by clinicians over years of research. So when new therapies arrive, it takes time for those therapies to propagate into the models, into the risk scoring models. I mean, not the AI models. So once hospitals moved into a fully electronic health record system, machine learning models can now help by using the data that's collected, so discrete information that's being collected in the charts, the patient charts. So neural networks and other complex models, they can exploit those features all at once to see how those interactions, or to see interactions that humans never really kind of wrote into rules, because they're just so complicated for a human brain to kind of interpret. So this overall, we have this explainability gap in the models today. The most accurate models are the neural networks, so the deep learning models, but those models are also kind of really hard to determine why they're making those decisions. And adding in a fuzzy component can help take our traditional feature attribution systems like all the other explainability metrics like GradCam or SHAP, which is what we use here. Those are the traditional explainability metrics that we use today, but they're really just kind of feature attributions. And so we can now break up those features into fuzzy categories that we can then guide our decision making and our ability to explain these models more granularly. So what are some terms that you need to know in this space so that this presentation makes more sense? Healthcare systems, those are the organizations that deliver care. So these are things like hospitals, clinics, provider networks. they currently rely on digital data because of an act that was passed in 2009 called the High Tech Act, which modernized the technology used in hospitals. Prior to that, it was mostly paper charts instead of digital charts. Mortality means that a patient's death. Sepsis is one of the most common causes of that outcome in like ICUs and EDs. Sepsis is a dangerous reaction to an infection that can lead to rapid organ failure. So these are the primary predictions that most of the papers that I used as like the basis for this kind of tracked. The EHR, or the electronic health record, is a digital version of the patient's chart. It basically contains everything about the patient's experiences within the health system. The intensive care unit, or ICU, treats the sickest patients who need constant monitoring. And then the emergency department, or ED, is where most of those critical cases begin, and then they progress to the ICU. Both settings are time sensitive, so having these prediction tools that can rapidly assess patients is really, really helpful. When I mentioned like NeuroFuzzy models, so those are the different ways that AIs can learn and reason. Neural models are the ones that learn from patterns and data, whereas fuzzy models are more like human-like rules that we use. And then NeuroFuzzy models pull those two together into a hybrid understanding. And then explainable AI, those are models those are components that we can apply to models that kind of extend our ability to understand why a decision is being made. Today, those methods are largely relied on feature attribution, which is not great, but it's the best that we have today. Explainable AI, it means that models can go deeper in being able to assess what a patient is experiencing. And so then finally, clinical decision support, that's what these tools are going to be used for. So that refers to systems that deliver insights to clinicians in real time so that a clinician can then make a decision on how to treat a patient. So the motivation for this study, I started this work because accuracy in healthcare AI, it's created this gap in what models can predict and what a clinician can use. And so in the ICU and the ED, decisions are made under pressure with incomplete information. And so clinicians need tools that support reality instead of like complicating it. Traditional scoring mechanisms, they've served as a baseline for decades, and they're very helpful. They're simple, they're stable, they're familiar, but they don't evolve as practice patterns and patient populations shift, at least not without clinician intervention and clinical research. So they can't absorb new information in the way like a learning system can. So on the other end of the spectrum, neural models, they push accuracy higher, but by picking up on nonlinear patterns across vitals and labs and demographics. The problem is interpretability. These models often behave like black boxes, and post hoc explanations are not always dependable, as we'll see later. So that's the core motivation for this study. We need models that are accurate enough to matter and interpretable enough to trust, to help clinicians make the right choices for patients, and then be able to hold up their moral and legal obligations associated with that. So there's three primary families that we're comparing in this study. Each one's a different part of the design space for both explainability and then also with AI. So one side is the neural network models. They operate directly on the raw features. They learn complex nonlinear patterns and usually deliver the strongest discrimination. Their weakness is interpretability. The internal decision process is hard to see, which complicates that safe clinical use. So on the other side of that spectrum then is the fuzzy rule-based systems. So these models operate on linguistic terms such as high lactate or low mean arterial pressure. They expose every step of the reasoning to match how clinicians think, but they struggle to capture enough of the signal when the physiology becomes complex, and physiology is complex. So the hybrid NeuroFuzzy models, though, they kind of sit between these extremes. They use that fuzzy membership functions to create like a structured, clinically meaningful input space, but then it trains the neural network on that representation so that it can learn those interactions, it can learn interactions that rule-based systems can't capture, but still offer the explanations that are framed in that familiar clinical language that the fuzzy rules provide. So how did I conduct this study? There's 5 structured phases. We begin by building a clean cohort from this Mimic4 data set. You can find that at physionet.org. You'll have to take some classes to they offer for free to be able to get credentialed so that you can access the data set. Normally around how should you legally treat the clinical information that you have access to, even though it's depersonalized so that you can't identify individual patients, and all the data is time shifted by like 200 years. You still can't you can't just disseminate this information. So you have to be able to credentialize it in some fashion. So that's what they do here at physionet.org. So only adult patients are included in this data set, and only the first ICU stay per patient is kept, so that it reduces correlation and keeps the cohort consistent. So we take this data and then we flatten it to that first 24 hours of data. So like vitals and labs are pulled out from the respective tables and then mapped onto summary statistics such as the mean, minimum, and maximum, and then the last recorded value. So that creates like a single reproducible row per ICU stay. This data is really complicated, and so we're trying to simplify it so that we can then build these models on top of it, and that helps us do an apples to apples comparison. In later studies, I'll be cutting the data differently so that I can go deeper on it. So in phase 3, then we prepare those features into the 3 model families. So the neural model uses standardized numeric inputs, while the fuzzy and hybrid models, they rely on those membership functions that we'll see shortly. And then we translate those into 5 physiological variables that are mapped to like linguistic categories. Phase 4 then covers the model development. So we're training that compact fuzzy rule system, and then a fully connected neural network, and then a NeuroFuzzy hybrid that applies the neural learning to the fuzzy memberships. And then all those are trained on identical data splits so that we can maintain this controlled comparison. And then finally, we evaluate discrimination, calibration, and then error patterns using ROC and precision recall curves. Breyer scores. I used some confusing matrices. They're not presented in this presentation, but they're available on the GitHub. And then I apply SHAP to both the neural and then the hybrid models to understand how each model reasons about risk. SHAP is like the highest quality explainability methodology that we have today. So across all 3 models, we saw a clear pattern. The neural network, it reached the highest discrimination with a test ROC of 0.787 and a precision recall of 0.488. So it's learning those rich non-linear interactions, but the learning curves show a growing separation between the training and the validation AUC. So it's indicating that it's overfitting moderately, like light moderately. So that's indicating that why its Breyer score, which is not presented on this page, is a bit weaker than it should be. But the model is this model is decent overall. The neural model is decent overall. The NeuroFuzzy model, however, it tracks the same ROC performance of 0.782 and holds a reasonably strong precision recall of 0.454. So the key difference is the calibration. Its brightest score is actually at 0.099, which is the best of all three of these models. And the learning curve that you see over here on the right, it's much more narrow. The scales on these are different. So the NeuroFuzzy model is actually only slightly overfitting, which makes it much more reliable in a sense on real data. The fuzzy membership space that this has acts as like a stabilizer for the model, and so it's constraining that model so that the probabilities behave more reliably, which is important in clinical settings. The fuzzy rule-based models, they stay fully interpretable, but they don't capture enough of the structure of the data, so the ROC is 0.649, which is low, and then the precision recall is 0.279, which is very low. It's only a little bit above baseline of 0.135. So that's not enough to actually recover any of the underlying mortality signals in this cohort. So pure neural networks, they maximize performance, but they lose reliability. The pure fuzzy models maximize transparency, but they lose the signal. And then the hybrid model preserves most of the neural network's discrimination while improving calibration and offering explanations that match clinical language. So how do these models explain their decisions? So this is the fuzzy model, the membership functions of the fuzzy model. And they're intrinsically interpretable as a feature of the model. These plots show the membership functions that drive the fuzzy and NeuroFuzzy components of the study. We're not really focused on these individual curves themselves, but I just want to kind of like show how they determine membership in each of these categories. So it's not just looking at creatinine or lactate or age or blood pressure as raw numbers. They're interpreting like each value and then assigning degrees of belonging in each one of these categories. So that means that the model's reasoning starts with this linguistic category that clinicians already use. So example, normal creatinine versus elevated versus high creatinine. And that's what a clinician would actually say. And then these are the values that a clinician would look at to determine that they actually belong in these different categories. So when a prediction is generated, the explanation is then built into this process. We can see which categories are fired, and then how strongly they're fired, and then which rule combinations are activated, so that when a patient's flagged with a high risk, it's because lactate's in a moderate region, oxygen saturation is drifting into the low region, and age is mapping to an older category. So that explanation comes directly from the model structure rather than the post hoc tools. This is why fuzzy systems are inherently interpretable. The pathway from input to decision is visible. We know which semantic categories contributed to the risk score and how they interacted. That structure also carries over to the NeuroFuzzy hybrid model, which used the same categories as the foundation for its learned interactions. So this is the SHAP outputs from both the neural models and the NeuroFuzzy models. Obviously, we don't have those for the fuzzy models because you can't apply SHAP to fuzzy models alone. So we're not focused on any individual features here. We're just showcasing the difference in how these two models are expressing the reasoning. So on the left, the neural model is explaining itself through these raw inputs. It's highlighting variables like temperature, white blood cell count, lactate. And those make sense clinically, but the explanation is just a number. It tells us what's mattering, but it's not telling us how those values are fitting into the clinical pattern. So for example, what temperature led to a decision? Which blood count numbers are leading to that decision? It doesn't make any sense. The clinician will have to still dig into all the data, which then they're taking all the time still to make those decisions. That's that means that these models then become useless because the clinician is still doing all the same work that they were doing prior. The NeuroFuzzy model on the right, though, it produces explanations at a higher level of abstraction. So instead of like raw numbers, it's highlighting concepts like moderate lactate or low oxygen saturation or normal blood pressure, or age groups, young, middle-aged, or old. And so those are the same linguistic categories that clinicians already use when thinking about deterioration. And so this shift is important because both models are finding, the same types of physiological drivers, but the hybrid model is expressing them in a way that is easier to interpret and easier to act on. That depth of explainability is what soft computing brings to this picture, and is really going to help clinicians understand why a model is saying the things that it's saying. So this study, it's presenting a clear trade-off. Those neural networks, they reach the highest level of accuracy, yet their calibration declines during training, and their explanations stay locked in those numerical spaces. So that's limiting how safely clinicians can use the outputs. The NeuroFuzzy model, it shows that we can recover most of the neural network's discrimination while gaining explanation that matches clinical reasoning. It's organizing information into familiar categories like moderate lactate, low oxygen saturation, which gives the model a vocabulary that clinicians recognize. So this points to a practical path for real deployment. Soft computing is it's not meant to replace those advanced deep learning, but it's offering a way to accelerate what it offers, or more fully features what a neural network can offer. In safety critical environments like the ICU, that balance is very, really important. So limitations of this study, there's a few of them. So the first one is that everything was trained on a single data set, which is that Mimic 4 data set, version 3.1. It's widely used in research, but models are actually built on, one hospital's workflow, and so the case mix doesn't always generalize to other environments. Before you would apply this type of model to other hospitals, you'd have to test to see if that model can work in that hospital. Especially with all the different EHRs, they have different ways of measuring, and then all the different types of laboratories that produce the lab results, they can actually vary in how they respond as well. Like the reference ranges are different from lab to lab, is what I'm saying. So then second, the flattening step, it collapses those first 24 hours into summary statistics, which it makes the analysis reproducible, but it removes the temporal patterns that stronger sequence models rely on. It places like a ceiling on the performance of all three of the approaches, which is why, I don't have massively accurate performance on these models. I kind of hobbled it by making a 24-hour window. Pros and cons of the approach. This 24-hour window allows it to be better for research, but more poor when I'm trying to apply it to an actual clinical world. Third, the fuzzy rule is based on intentionally small subset of features. So this limited set of variables is limiting to the overall model's performance. This kept it so that it was easily interpretable, but it made it less useful to the overall prediction. That's why the fuzzy model was a poor performer overall. It was a design choice that I made specifically to preserve that interpretability, but that restriction kind of, I don't know, the fuzzy model itself wasn't very useful for this, but it was a good contrast point for the NeuroFuzzy hybrid rule. Fourth, SHAP has some of its own weaknesses. So kernel SHAP can be unstable in nonlinear regions, and so and the results depend heavily on the background distribution that was chosen. So the plots here offer one of the interpretability lens, but it's not a complete picture of model reasoning. And then finally, we intentionally limited the feature set to keep those explainability comparisons fair across the models. That helps isolate those modeling differences, but it reduces the accuracy of all the approaches. Having a more broad spectrum of features might help create a more accurate model, but it also obfuscates what a research paper can reveal. So these limitations, they shape how we should read those results. The study tells us about the trade-off between the accuracy and the interpretability, but this isn't about maximum possible performance in each model family. So I would focus more on, this paper focuses more on that explanation lens as opposed to model accuracy. So future work can move in like 6 different directions, I think. First, we need some external validation. Single site training, it limits those generalized ability of the models. So testing these models across different hospitals would be helpful. Second, the flattened 24-hour view should be replaced with a temporal model that captures trajectories. That way, physiological trends can carry some of this information. We're not using those, obviously. So, using those trajectories that the physiological trends can reveal will it'll certainly help the accuracy of the models, and then also potentially be another aspect that can be explained, which would be interesting. Third, fuzzy components need to evolve to do it. So doing another study, I would actually broaden some of those fuzzy memberships. Membership functions and rule sets that can be learned or adapted rather than handcrafted, which is what I did. We could close the gap with those neural baselines by learning rules instead of building them manually. Fourth, uncertainty, it needs to be made explicit. So probabilistic and Bayesian extensions can show how confident the model is in each prediction, which is more important in high acuity environments. Fifth, the workflow matters. So we need studies that measure how clinicians use hybrid explanations and whether they improve decision making. So that's beyond the scope of computer science study. It would more involve what a health system could study so that it can determine if investing in these models is actually useful. And then finally, this project's constrained to a feature set to keep those comparisons clean, but a production system could draw from a much richer set of clinical inputs, which would lift performance across all the models. So the key takeaways here, accuracy versus interpretability. Those models, they lead to that discrimination, but they offer limited transparency. So like neural models, obviously can't look at the weights and see what they're trying to say. The hybrid models have a major advantage. NeuroFuzzy models, they retain most of that performance that the neural networks provide, but then they improve the calibration and explanation quality by having those fuzzy breakouts. And then finally, actionable explanations. The fuzzy-based reasoning produces those explanations that the neural network models can't, just by the nature of their being. So if you have any questions, this is normally where we would take those questions. However, you can reach out to me directly. My address here is in the upper right corner. Obviously, you can visit me in Madison, Wisconsin if you'd like. And then my LinkedIn is on the bottom left. Feel free to reach out. And have a great day. Thanks for listening.